Okay, so I'm going to head to my sword rack and welcome you to our first class of our double-edged sword study for the fall. So what we're going to be looking at, if you have something to work with in terms of a practice sword, you're welcome to grab that. Things like meter sticks and rulers and stuff like that will also work fairly well. A piece of dowel can work fairly well as well. So for those people who are working with a sword, what I want to work on initially is grip. So quite often I watch people kind of doing their sword work with a pinched grip between their fingers and things of this sort. What we have to remember is that we're holding on to a weapon, and that if we were to imagine ourselves using it, which I don't think any of us will find ourselves in a position of doing, but we have to imagine that the other person would be really happy if they're able to knock this out of my hands and I no longer had my weapon. And so this is why we've got to watch out for getting into grips that allow an opening between the thumb and the forefinger, because that can be removed from the hands fairly quickly. So what we're going to look at, I'll bring this up as close as I can here. What we're going to look at is a grip that is kind of based around the middle finger and the thumb overlapping. And this is going to feel really awkward when you're first getting going with it. It's not going to feel very comfortable. So you should be able to lift the other three fingers off the sword and kind of have a wrap between the finger and the thumb. What this is going to allow is the lower two fingers are going to be used for pulling in order to pull the weapon and make the weapon move forward, and the index finger is used to kind of pull the weapon back. So our rotation point is going to be around that finger and thumb. Just like when gymnasts are on the high bars and stuff like that, they get those wraparounds because this is a strong grip. Now, we're not wanting to choke off the weapon, and we don't want to be so relaxed with the weapon that we can't hold it and use it. So that basic grip is thumb in. You're going to be pretty close to your guard when you're doing this. So you can almost let the guard kind of rest into your hands a little bit. And then you're looking to get that thumb and middle finger. Sometimes you can go thumb and index finger, but the middle finger is going to give you that really good sort of rotation point. So you can get this feeling of push, pull, push, pull. So just for a second, give that a bit of a try. Just don't knock your camera or anything off of tables. And you want to go pull and pull. So you're rotating that. That's going to give you the ability to push and thrust and change the weapon around. Okay, so we've got grip. Now, when we're using grip, sometimes we're going to release parts of it. And the reason we want to have that finger is so that when we release to let things roll, we can kind of let go with those lower two fingers and let that roll around. So we can let go and we can let that roll. We can squeeze, we can pull, we can push. So you've got this kind of feeling of playing with the weapon. Now, like I said to our Tai Chi class, we're going to try and figure out a lot of this stuff in both hands. You don't have to, but it's one of those things for me, my massage therapists and physiotherapists I work with, they can tell when I'm doing a whole lot of sword work because one arm starts getting heavily developed and the other one isn't picking up that same development. So you don't have to when I suggest it, but if you want to while we're doing this, you can also learn how to use the sword in both hands. So you can play it from both sides. And again, you're going to want to have that feeling of thumb into the weapon, wrap the index finger and thumb. So you kind of got the edge lined up with the gap between the finger and the thumb, so that the finger edge is away from you and the thumb edge is towards you. If it's neutral, then you're wrapping that finger so you can kind of get a grip on the blade, and that's where you're going to work that sword from initially. Okay, some of the things we're going to work on before we get into doing sets and forms is just getting comfortable with some of the directions and the way that the weapon works. So there is a way of carrying your sword that is part of sword etiquette and part of the forms as well, is that when you are not using the sword, you're going to place it in your opposite hand so that you're going to go fingers up the handle and you're going to wrap your hand around the guard and then you can kind of tuck it away. So this should end up with the blade up the back of your arm and out of the way. So this is a way of kind of carrying the sword. This is where most sets will start, where you'll have it in your opposite hand and you'll have it so it's up against your arm. You'll actually see in a lot of sets, particularly in the Tai Chi sets, that they'll actually start the set with the sword in this arm and deflecting and learning how to use the scabbard and the side and thrusting and punching with the handle with it up against the arm. So that's a bit of etiquette work, but it's also part of the set. Some people do this by grabbing around the handle and around the blade. You can certainly get away with that with an unsharpened weapon. You certainly won't get away with that with a sharpened weapon. So in the back of the hand, and you should be able to kind of lift and move that so you can lift it up and you can also press it back down. So your fingertips are going to be facing towards the pommel of your sword while the hand is grabbing around the guard and you're laying along the handle of the weapon. There'll be lots of different ways that you'll pick this up, but the most common one is just to kind of replace the one with the other, where you'll be going to your finger and middle finger and thumb grip, and you'll have that ready to roll. Okay, so let's look at some difficult exercises that are very fundamental to wielding the sword effectively. Sifu Sam Master talks a lot about this, and he divides the sword into 3 main pivot points. You're going to have a pivot point at the tip, you're going to have a pivot point in the middle, and you're going to have a pivot point at the hand and at the wrist. So these aren't balance points. We're not trying to necessarily keep the sword in balance here. What we're working to do is to make those areas where the sword will pivot around. So we're going to start, the main pivot is that we're going to start with today. I'm trying to get my sword so it can be seen in the light well, is this middle pivot point. So what I want you to do is I want you to hold the sword out in front of you, and you're going to let the tip drop and the handle rise, and notice that it's going to pivot around the middle section of the sword. So you want to go handle up, tip down, handle up. That's it. So you're kind of going, drop the tip, settle the handle, handle up, handle down. And a lot of movements are going to be based on whether we're rotating around the middle of the weapon or whether we're going to rotate around the wrist or whether we're going to rotate around the tip. So in this case, let's just try a couple more. We'll do it on both hands. So we're going to go tip down, handle up. So it's almost like somebody who's holding this middle part of your sword, and your sword is going to rotate around that middle section. I'm going to switch hands. You don't necessarily have to. So the same idea, around the middle, around the middle. Now we're letting this tip down, and then we're going to do another exercise that's going to allow that to still rotate around the middle, but the arm motion is going to be a little trickier. So let's just do 2 more out here. So out and down. Now this is moving to the outside of the body. I'm rolling my arm to the outside, and notice that middle section of my sword is staying fairly consistent with its height and with its alignment as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to the other hand. Now, the harder version of this middle pivot, so we've got this outside pivot, is the inside one. So this is where we're going to be tipping the handle in towards ourselves and then back down. So it's almost like you're doing a bicep curl where you're kind of pulling this in, but you're going to tip down and raise up, or tip down to take the tip up. And again, I'm rotating around that middle point in the sword. So these skills are going to take some time, but they're going to be very important to how we control the weapon later. So now if you want to work a drill for that middle pivot, you could go out to the outside, around to the inside, out to the outside, and around to the inside. And again, as your arm maybe fatigues, if you're getting used to having a weapon in your hand, you can switch that up and see if you can get that opposite hand intelligent with the weapon as well. Okay, while we're working on this, let's talk about a tradition in the Chinese arts for the hand that is not holding the weapon. So this is going to do, if you want to call it a mudra or a hand shaping, sometime called sword hand. So you're going to make the Spock kind of movement here, and then you're going to curl down the outer two fingers, and then you're going to wrap the thumb around. The idea is that energetically, it balances the two out. There's also a lot of sort of, magic kind of things that they talk about for warding off things and pressure points and all sorts of stuff. What it does is it means that you don't lose track of this hand as much. If you're having to focus on the opposing hand, and it's not, hey, peace, dude, it's kind of like the sword position, it helps you to keep focus on both parts of the body. So whichever hand that the sword is not in is going to be in the Gim hand, in the sword hand. Now that is really the shape that we had when we were holding the sword in the opposing hand as well, was that Gim hand. So just imagine you're still holding the sword here, and you can make that Gim hand in the other side. Quite often with sword work, we have to do one of two things with that opposing hand. Either it needs to be very far out of the play, or it needs to be inside the guard of the weapon or part of that weapon. Sometimes that's supporting the wrist, but a lot of the time that's just getting the idea that if I forget about this hand in a sword battle, my opponent won't, and they will take that hand off. And so we've got to have some attention to where that hand is while we're playing. So if we go back to our middle pivot point drill, what we're going to do here is we tip towards the outside is we're going to touch the hand on the wrist. So the fingertips on the wrist. And then as we settle, it's going to be on there. So this point on the wrist is going to be moving and transferring. So we go 1, 2. So that hand can come along for the ride. 1, 2. So we're up, and we've got that hand in position, and then we're back, and then we're up, and then we're back, we're up, and we're back. To work the other direction, we can bring this hand, and now it's coming sort of on the inside of the wrist, and we're turning here. So we've got this lifting of the handle, we're kind of got the hand in the wrist position, and then we settle, and we play. So this hand can come along, or we said this hand can get out of the way. So it can sit back and out of the way a little bit more, or you can kind of play between those positions. And you will, as we do more and more with the work, be joining this hand to the sword hand and taking it off. But you want to keep that in mind, that that's kind of what you're working on. With this middle pivot, we've got that in the hand, up against the wrist. Let's just take a couple more seconds. I'll switch hands and roll, and we've got that position, and settle, and out, and back, and one side, and settle, and the other, and settle. 1, and settle. Okay. Wrist point as the rotation point. So wrist point as a rotation point means that my sword is going to move around my wrist. And there's different variations of this. We're going to start with allowing the sword to drop. We're going to turn out so the palm is facing out. We're going to roll it over and bring it back. So it's going to go drop and roll. So here now, we're pivoting the wrist. So now the weapon is being rotated around the hand, around the guard and the wrist. And in this case, we're going to the outside of the body. Now, we want to take, so hard to find the angles for this one, is we want to take the blade and we're going to turn so that the flat of the blade is now turned out. We don't want to cut the kitty. We're going to come back and we're going to chop. So we're going to let it drop. Oh no, and cut. I may have to put somebody on the porch. So we're going to drop and cut. Drop and down. So here's where we're using, remember where I was talking at the beginning about this idea, squeeze with the bottom fingers. So we are in here and we're kind of pulling. And I said we could release those. So now I've got this connection. I'm using the middle finger, the index finger, and the inside of the knuckle as my rotation point. As it rolls, I'm going to chop. Oh no, kitty, you do not want to play with this. So I'm going to go roll and chop. Roll and chop. So this is going around my wrist. Nice. If you want to try working it on the other hand, you can. You don't have to feel an obligation to work both sides right away, but I'll show it on the other side so it helps. So we're going to come around and notice how I'm letting that handle come up to the sky and then I'm squeezing to bring that back down. So it rolls and it strikes, it rolls and it strikes. Thank you, Rosie, for enticing the kitty away. 1 and 2. That's it. So roll and strike, roll and strike. And it turns out. So the blade is turning outwards a little bit as you work this. Turn, turn. So you should be able to, in the end, kind of have this rolling motion around your wrist. So see how that pivot, how my wrist is staying fairly consistent and the sword is pivoting around the wrist. Okay, other way around the wrist. So we're still on the outside. I know there's so much to take on. And these are just getting the basic motion. So we're rolling and striking, but we could also pivot around this wrist for uppercuts. Roll, roll, roll. So one way and the other. Just getting used to working the weapon a little bit, getting used to it in the hand. Same on the other hand, around the wrist or around. Now, usually if it's going to come around, we're going to end up taking it on both sides. That's where we're going to end up going, especially with our uppercuts and these wrist pivot points. So get a feel for rolling the wrist, rolling the wrist. One side, other side for rolling the wrist. So now if I'm facing forward, we were just doing to the sword arm and around. Now we're going to go to the opposite side. So we're going to, from here, think about dropping the tip. So you're rotating around the wrist, turn, and come back down with the sword. So we're going to go to the outside and down, to the opposite side. So again, here I'm rolling around my wrist, but I'm on that outside or opposite side to the sword. So we could get a nice little drill going. We go to the outside and then we go to the sword side, non-sword side, sword side. So these are downwards chops. Across, turn over. And remember we were talking about squeezing with the fingers. See how using those fingers, that's why we've got this pivot point in the thumb and index finger. So if we squeeze, it's going to bring that sword out. So around the wrist and out, around the wrist and out, around and out. On the outside, around the wrist and out, around and out. To do the drill on both sides, one side, other side, one side, other side. So you're just getting comfortable with that weapon in your hand, and your forearm and your arm might start to feel the work that we're doing here. I'm going to switch hands. You don't have to, and we'll do a few repetitions on the other side. So around and down, that gets our towards the opposite side of the body, and then open and roll. So see how now my pivot point is my wrist. I'm pivoting and rolling the sword around the wrist. Nice. That's it. So one side or on the other arm, and we're rolling around the wrist. Your forearms are going to love me by the end of class if you're working with a weapon with a bit of weight. Okay. Last pivot point. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's leave it as the rolling down for today. We'll look at rolling up and underneath another time. Okay, last pivot point for today, and this one is going to be difficult. This is the pivot point where the tip of the sword is the pivot point. So what we want to be able to do is manipulate the sword so the tip is going to stay fairly still. This will create a feeling where the sword is kind of floating a little. So let's start with our guard position. So we've got here with the sword kind of settled. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave the tip as the rotation point and bring the whole sword up and down, up and down. This one's hard to do. So you're thinking of that tip staying as still as you can. So initially we did this rise and fall with the arm, and we went through the middle point, and both the tip and the handle changed. Now we're trying to keep the tip in place as we raise the handle up, and then as we settle that handle back down, the tip of the sword is kind of hovering in place. Again, we can join that other hand in with our Gim hand and work it on the wrist. We can just try and figure out. So it's like you're cranking the handle, but you'll notice that my tip, I know it's hard to see, is kind of staying in center with me. So that tip doesn't move, that tip stays hovering in place. So we're really trying to find a rotation point around there. Good. If you want to change arms, you're welcome to do so, or to try it, to keep working it on the same side. So up and down. This one is hard. It really takes, and this is when people talk about in Tai Chi, that one of the reasons for taking on weapons work is to try to learn how to extend your chi, your influence, out to the weapon and beyond. Here's an exercise that really makes you do that, because you have to really think about extending your control right out to the tip of that weapon so that that tip stays still and you're able to rotate the handle up and down. Okay, so much like with the midpoint, where we did one to the outside and one to the inside, well, that's going to be the same with the tip. We just did the one where I'm moving away from my center core, and the tip was staying relatively still as we take this up and down. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try and take it up on this side. So we're coming across our body. And again, the tip wants to stay fairly settled. So I'm keeping my focus out to the end of the weapon, and I'm able to raise the handle, and the tip stays where it is. Now, one of the ways to kind of cheat your way into this or work it is to, kind of find somewhere where you can stick the tip of your sword up against something, and then you can get a feel for moving the handle and not necessarily the tip, but I want you to put holes and things all around your house. So get that feel for inside, settle, outside. And the tip doesn't move much. Your goal is to keep that tip going forward and outwards throughout the whole exercise. Good. For those who want to try it in the other hand, take a little bit of time, switch to the other hand and lift and settle to the outside, through middle and inside and down. Arc up. Oh, it's hard on that opposite hand, and around and down. Okay, a couple more exercises on maintaining the tip as a kind of a floating point. So this exercise, it's going to be tricky because my sword is going to be edge facing side to side. So I've got my palm kind of flat. I have the bevel of the sword facing up towards the ceiling. And what I want to be able to do here is, I'm so black with my clothing, is turn the handle one way and the other without that tip moving. So I'm traveling this in a flat plane, side to side. So if I was doing this upright, it'd kind of be like a pendulum, tick, tock, tick, tock. And my tip stays fairly still. And I'm doing that on this flat plane, thunk, thunk. And I'm trying to keep the tip in one place. So back, forth, back, forth. The other exercise in this series is up, down, up, down. So I'm trying to let that sword rise and fall without the tip. So the handle is going up and down, but I'm trying to keep the tip as stable as possible. So you can go side, side, up, down, side, side, up, down. So tip down, or the tip stays fairly still, and we're going up and down, and then we're also going side, side. Okay. Last thing to take on today, and we'll go back through a lot of this again next week. We're going to join those. So take a second just to watch. This is an exercise in making your sword float. So now the handle is moving, but the tip is staying relatively in place. So I want to be able to circle this, circle the handle, but the tip is going to stay in place. And it kind of starts to look like the sword is floating. And these are just exercises to get control over the blade. So I've got pivot in the tip, I've got pivot point in the middle, I've got pivot point around the wrist. Tip of the sword pivot, middle of the sword pivots, wrist pivots. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. So what I'd like you to work on over the week is trying to get some of those pivots happening in both arms. So get a sense that the tip stays still and the handle is moving. Oh, I don't do this so well on my left hand. I'll have to practice that. And then middle stays still. Both sides of the sword move. Wrist is fairly stationary and the sword moves. So that's our three main pivots. Things we're going to look at next week. We're going to review through our pivots and we're going to talk about cutting directions. When we get into swords, what we have to remember is swords are not a bludgeoning weapon. So they're not a percussive weapon, they're a bladed weapon. And bladed weapons mean, if you're cutting meat for dinner, you don't take your knife and just smack it on top of the roast. You have to draw and pull. So we're going to talk about cuts next week and start to introduce some of the main cutting actions, and those will link to the pivots as well. So if you're practicing your pivots, wrist, center, and tip pivots, you will be working on a lot of the deflections and techniques of the sword are going to be based on all of those pivots we're working on, and then edge alignments will become a part of what we're going to work on too. So thanks today for joining in on our first sword lesson.